The man at the head of the table looked at Iris the way people look at mud tracked onto a clean floor, not with anger exactly, but with the particular irritation of someone who feels their evening has been ruined through no fault of their own. "And who," said Aldous Mercer, setting down his crystal glass with a small deliberate click, "did you say this young woman was?" Silas didn't answer right away. He stood behind Iris's chair with one hand resting on the back of it, and he looked at Aldous Mercer the way a man looks at something he has already decided about. "I didn't say," Silas told him, "but since you're asking, she's with me." Iris kept her hands in her lap. She kept her chin level. She had worn her best dress, the blue wool one with the buttons she'd repaired herself 3 times, and she knew without looking that it was wrong for this room, wrong for this table, wrong for the way the chandelier caught the silver and threw it back in pieces of light. She knew it the moment she walked in. But she also knew something else, something her mother had told her once in their small kitchen in Pictou County, Nova Scotia, scrubbing potatoes over a chipped enamel sink. "A room full of people who want you to feel small," her mother had said, "is just a room. Walk through it." So Iris walked through it. She had come to Red Deer, Alberta, 3 months earlier with $40 in her coat pocket, a suitcase that had belonged to her father, and a letter of reference from the schoolteacher in Pictou, who had taught her everything she knew about property records and surveying law, which was more than most people in this part of the country knew at all. The letter said she was diligent, precise, and unlikely to be deterred by difficulty. The schoolteacher, a woman named Mrs. Parrish, had underlined unlikely to be deterred twice. Iris had read that letter so many times the fold lines were soft as cloth. She got a room at the boarding house on Mackenzie Street run by a woman named Mrs. Dunn, who charged fair rates and asked no questions, and she got a job at the land registry office on the main street of Red Deer, where she organized the filing system that the previous clerk had let collapse into something resembling a compost heap. Within 2 weeks she had cataloged every deed and title and transfer of land in the county going back 40 years. Within a month she had noted something. The something had a name, Mercer Holdings. It appeared in the records the way mold appears in a wall, gradually, and then everywhere at once. A quarter section here, a half section there. Land that had belonged to families named Price and Tanner and Colquhoun, land that had been homesteaded and broken and planted, suddenly transferred to Mercer Holdings Limited, at prices that made no sense, signed over in documents that were technically legal but that had a smell about them Iris couldn't shake. She had asked her supervisor, a dry, careful man named Mr. Fisk, about it one afternoon. Mr. Fisk had looked at the files for a long time. Then he had closed them, set them back on the shelf, and said, "The Mercer family has been in this county for 30 years, Miss Dolan. I'd encourage you not to look too hard at things that aren't your concern." Iris had said, "Yes, sir." She did not stop looking. She met Silas Crane at a livestock auction in early October, which was not where she expected to meet anyone, but then she had not expected a great many things about Alberta. He was not what she would have called a handsome man in the obvious way. Not tall, not polished, but he had the kind of face that got more interesting the longer you looked at it, and he listened when people talked, which in her experience was rarer than it had any right to be. He bid on a sorrel mare and lost, and then he stood next to Iris at the fence because there was nowhere else to stand, and they watched the next lot come through. "You're the woman from the land office," he said. "I am," Iris said. "Silas Crane." He offered his hand. "Iris Dolan." He had a cattle operation east of town, modest by the standards of the county, inherited from his uncle, and kept solvent through hard work, and Iris suspected a good deal of stubbornness. His neighbors were the Price family, whose quarter section had been transferred to Mercer Holdings 8 months ago. Under circumstances the Prices described as a forced sale, though they couldn't prove it. They were living in a rented house in town now, the father working at the mill, the mother taking in laundry. Their oldest son, who was 12, had stopped going to school. Silas told her this without drama, the way people tell you facts they have carried so long they've stopped expecting them to shock anyone. "I know about the Prices," Iris said. He looked at her then, really looked. "Do you?" "I work at the land registry," she said. "I know about a lot of things." The dinner at Aldous Mercer's house was not Silas's idea, and it was not Iris's. It was Aldous Mercer's idea, which was itself a thing worth paying attention to. Aldous Mercer was 61 years old, the patriarch of the Mercer family, the kind of man who had been powerful so long he'd forgotten it was a thing that could change. He had invited the significant landowners of the county to a dinner at his house. A house that sat on a hill west of town and had more rooms than anyone needed, to discuss, as the invitation put it, the future of agricultural consolidation in Red Deer County. Silas had received an invitation. He had told Iris about it over coffee at the diner on Mackenzie Street, 2 weeks after the livestock auction, and she had said, "Go, why? Because I want to know what he says in a room full of people he thinks are on his side, and you. What about me?" Silas looked at her for a moment. "Come with me," he said. It wasn't a question. He said it the way you say something when you've already thought it through. Iris looked down at her coffee. Then she said, "He'll use me against you. People like Aldous Mercer always do that. Find the weakest-looking thing near you and point at it." "I know," Silas said. "And you still want me there?" "I think," said carefully, "that Aldous Mercer is used to being the only one in the room who knows things. I'd like to change that." So she went. She wore the blue wool dress with the repaired buttons, and she sat at that long table with its chandelier light and its silver, and its people who looked at her, the way Aldous Mercer had looked at her, and she kept her hands in her lap and her chin level, and she listened. Aldous Mercer talked for a long time about the future of the county, about efficiency, about how small operations were a liability in difficult economic times, about how consolidation was not predation but protection, his word, offered with the smooth confidence of a man who had refined the argument over many years of practice. He talked about what he could offer to families struggling with debt, how he could ensure the land stayed productive, how he was, in his way, a steward. Iris listened to all of it. The man to her left, a rancher named Hugh Colquhoun, whose family had been in the county almost as long as the Mercers, was nodding along. So were 2 others at the table. One woman, gray-haired and sharp-eyed, whose name Iris had learned was Agnes Tanner, was not nodding. She was looking at her plate with the expression of someone trying to decide whether to speak. Mercer reached the end of his prepared remarks and looked around the table with the magnanimous air of a man expecting applause. Then Hugh Colquhoun said, "What does the girl think?" It was said the way it was meant, diminishing, dismissive, and several people at the table smiled. Iris felt the shift in the room, the way people lean slightly in when they expect someone to flinch. Silas's hand tightened almost imperceptibly on the back of her chair. Iris set her water glass down. "I think," she said, "that between 1919 and 1927, Mercer Holdings acquired 14 properties in this county. I think that 9 of those acquisitions involved debt instruments held by the Bank of Calgary, where Mr. Mercer's brother-in-law sits on the board. I think that in 6 cases, the terms of those debt instruments were altered within 60 days of foreclosure in ways that accelerated the timeline for the borrowers and removed the standard grace period. And I think that if you were to compare the assessed values of those properties at the time of transfer with the prices paid for them, you would find a discrepancy averaging 38% below market." The table was quiet. Agnes Tanner looked up from her plate. "Those are numbers," Hugh Colquhoun said, though his voice had changed. "Yes," Iris said. "I work at the land registry. Numbers are rather the point." Aldous Mercer had not moved. He was looking at Iris with an expression she couldn't quite categorize. Not rage, not fear. Something more complicated than either. He said, "I don't know what you think you're implying, young woman." "I'm not implying anything," Iris said. "I'm describing what the records show. The implication is yours to make of what you will." She had not expected what happened next. Agnes Tanner said, "I lost my husband's quarter section in 1923. The bank called the debt in February. We'd made every payment for 11 years, she said it quietly, to the table, like a woman putting down something heavy. I always thought there was something wrong about it. I just couldn't say what. The rancher on Mercer's right, a man named Theodore Price, not a relation to the family Iris had been thinking of, she'd find out later, just an unfortunate coincidence of names, cleared his throat and said, "I've heard similar." From the Colquhouns, actually. Before he stopped, glanced at Hugh Colquhoun. Hugh Colquhoun was staring at the tablecloth. "My father took that deal," he said after a moment. "He didn't want to. He didn't think he had a choice." Aldous Mercer stood up. It was meant to be commanding. It fell short of that. "This is a dinner," he said. "Not a tribunal." "No," Silas said. He was still standing behind Iris's chair, and his voice was perfectly level. "But it might become one if the right people ask the right questions of the provincial land commissioner. which they could do. Starting Monday. It did not start Monday. It took longer than that. These things always take longer than you expect, and they cost more, and they are harder than anyone warns you they will be. Iris had known that going in. She had organized the documents herself, working evenings at the registry office with Mr. Fisk's tacit permission. He had not told her to stop, which she chose to read as encouragement. And she had sent a summary to a solicitor in Calgary named Mr. Brody, who had a reputation for taking cases that other solicitors found inconvenient. Mr. Brody took the case. It was 5 months before anything came of it, and in those 5 months a number of things happened. Aldous Mercer's lawyer sent a letter to the land registry suggesting that Iris had misused her access to official records for private purposes, and Mr. Fisk, to his credit, wrote back to say that reviewing records in the public interest was precisely what the records were for. The Bank of Calgary conducted a quiet internal review of the debt instruments in question and found, to the surprise of no one paying attention, that several of them had been altered. The bank's solicitors began a separate proceeding that Iris only found out about third hand through Agnes Tanner, who had begun stopping by the registry office on Tuesday afternoons. "They're trying to get ahead of it," Agnes said, on one such Tuesday. She sat across from Iris's desk with a cup of tea and the particular satisfaction of a woman who has been right about something for a long time. "Make it look like they found the problem themselves." "They can try," Iris said. "Will it work?" Iris thought about the documents she'd given Mr. Brody. The dates on the alterations, the paper trail from the bank to Mercer Holdings to the properties, laid out in a sequence that was, as Mr. Brody had put it, difficult to characterize as anything other than what it was. "No," she said. "It won't work." The hearing was held in March, in a provincial office in Edmonton, and Iris took the train up with Silas and Agnes Tanner and the family from Pictou County, who had nothing to do with any of this, except that Iris had telephoned her mother the night before she left, and her mother had said, "I'm proud of you," and Iris had sat on the edge of her bed in the boarding house on Mackenzie Street and cried, quietly, for about 10 minutes, and then washed her face and gone to pack. Mr. Brody was good. He was not warm, exactly, but he was precise in the way that matters in a room like that, where every word lands on the record and stays there. Iris sat behind him and answered questions when she was called to, and she watched Aldous Mercer's face across the room as the documents were entered into evidence, one by one. There is a particular expression people make when they realize the story they have been telling themselves. The story in which they are the steward, the benefactor, the reasonable man doing what needed to be done, is not the story the room is reading. Aldous Mercer made that expression. Iris watched it happen and felt nothing much, which surprised her a little. She had expected anger or satisfaction or some bright, clean feeling. Instead, she felt tired and clear, the way you feel after a long piece of work is finally done. Aldous Mercer was found to have colluded with the bank to engineer foreclosures on properties at below market rates, in breach of provincial statute. Mercer Holdings was ordered to pay restitution to the 9 affected families. The brother-in-law resigned from the bank's board. The properties that could be returned were returned. For the ones that had been resold, there was money, which was not the same as land but was something. Agnes Tanner got back her husband's quarter section. She called Iris from Edmonton the day the order came through, and her voice on the telephone was the voice of a woman who had been carrying something for a very long time and had just set it down. In April, Iris's mother came out from Pictou County on the train. She was a small woman with gray hair pinned under a good hat, and she had never been west of Ontario, and she stood on the platform at Red Deer Station and looked at the sky, which in April in Alberta has a quality to it, a specific pale wide blue that doesn't exist anywhere else, and said, "Oh, that's something," Iris said. "I know." Her mother stayed 2 weeks. She liked Silas, which Iris had expected, and she liked Agnes Tanner, which Iris had also expected, and she liked the land itself in the way that people who have grown up near the sea sometimes like flat country, with a recognition that surprised her. She said it reminded her of the water, the way it went on. On the last evening before she left, Iris's mother sat at the table in the kitchen of the small house. Iris was renting on the edge of town. She had left the boarding house in February and drank tea and looked out the window at the lake off the fields. "You're happy here," her mother said. Not a question. Iris thought about it honestly. "I think I might be," she said. "That man," her mother said, "the one who stood behind your chair, Iris looked at her tea. He looked at you, her mother said, like you were something he intended to be careful with. I know, Iris said. That's worth more than you might think, her mother said. A man who knows how to be careful. The following year, in the spring, mud season, when the roads were rivers and the fields were every shade of brown that exists, Silas asked Iris to marry him, not with great ceremony but in the kitchen of his house. On a Thursday evening when she had come for dinner, and they had been talking about the drainage problem in the East Field, which was not a romantic topic, but which was also, in its way, entirely them. He said, I want you to stay, Iris said. I am staying, he said. I mean, I know what you mean, she said. He looked at her. Outside, the wind moved across the field in a long, low sound that was particular to this place, this season. Then will you? Iris thought about the blue dress with the repaired buttons. The dinner table, the chandelier, the look on Aldous Mercer's face, when she said 38% below market, and the room went quiet. She thought about her mother's face on the station platform, the pale, wide April sky. She thought about all the things she'd thought she didn't have and turned out to have anyway. Yes, she said, I will. They were married in June in a small ceremony at the church in town, and Agnes Tanner cried, and Mr. Fisk shook Silas's hand, and told Iris she was the best clerk the registry had ever had, and she thanked him and thought she might keep the job a while longer. Silas said, Whatever you want, Iris said, then I'll keep it. That winter she began studying land law in earnest, through a correspondence program at the University of Alberta. It took 3 years, working evenings at the kitchen table, while Silas read across from her, and it was the hardest thing she had done, and also, in a strange way, one of the most satisfying. The way things are satisfying when they are entirely your own. She passed her examinations in the spring of 1931, which was not a good year for Alberta or for anyone, but which was, for Iris, the year she became the first woman admitted to practice property law in Red Deer County. Agnes Tanner threw a party. It was small and loud, and ran until 11 o'clock, which was late for that part of the world, and at some point in the middle of it Silas found Iris standing at the edge of the room, and handed her a glass of cider, and stood next to her, and didn't say anything for a while, which was one of the things she loved about him. Then he said, Your mother was right. She usually is, Iris said. She said you'd do something remarkable, when she was here, the last night, before she left. He looked at his glass. I told her I believed her. Iris looked out at the room. Agnes laughing, Mr. Fisk standing stiffly near the window, the Colquhoun family, the Prices, people who had lost things and gotten some of them back, people who had trusted her and been right to, and she felt something she didn't have a precise name for, which was rare for a woman who had always been good with words. Something like, arrived. Something like, this is the place. I know you did, she said, and she leaned into him, and outside the Alberta sky was full of stars, that particular dense scatter of them you only see when you're far from the lights of cities, when the dark is really dark and the light really counts. She was 31 years old, and she had come west with $40 and a letter, and a kind of stubbornness her mother had underlined twice, and she had built something true in a place she had not expected to love, and she loved it. That was the whole of it, and it was enough.